was the gas valve, which he had on the truck, fortunately. So it is fixed. I don't know how much it's going to cost. It'd not be cheap, probably. Pardon me? I'm not starting yet. I'm talking. I got to get the PowerPoint open on mine. You would think I learn, but I don't.
No,
You would think he would learn, but he doesn't.
We were fixing your projection issue we were having, how it was so small, and then when we fixed it, other things happened. There we go. All right.
Okay, I'm going to talk to you about the apostles today. And what I'm going to show you is the apostles were groups of families.
Move your mic a little closer, please.
They were closely related people. When you read about the different apostles, you kind of get the idea, well, this one came from here. They all came from the same place, basically. They all came from Galilee. They were all raised as Jews. They had different personalities, but they basically had a lot of things in common, like they were all Jews. So if they were going to start a church there in Galilee, we wouldn't expect an interracial church, because there just were, there were some Syrophoenicians that lived north of there, but they weren't at that point ready to receive anybody else into their Judaism. So I want to look at the different things that the New Testament says about these 12 people, and I want to show you who their families were and how they were related to each other, and a little bit about their personalities, and the fact that they were all knuckleheads, all 12 of them. They all had some failures in their ministry. And I want to start it with this passage, Matthew 26:8, and finish it with Matthew 26:8. I'm not going to say anything about this verse until the end, but I want to read it. When the disciples saw it, that it is the lady pouring the oil on Jesus' feet, they were angry. Why this waste? For this anointment could have been sold for a large sum and the money given to the poor. I'll talk about that a little bit later. Now, during those days, he went out to the mountain to pray, and he spent the night in prayer to God. And as I was looking at this scripture, I was looking up to what different people had said about it in commentaries and stuff. And in the Jewish commentary, there was this little tidbit which I found really interesting. And the rabbis from that time said, when you go to pray, God prays. Now, how many of you thought that God prays? Think about it this way. God, I want this, I want that. God, no, this is what I want you to do. We're good at telling what we want God to do for us, but we're not too good about listening to what God says that we should do. But in this particular case, Jesus goes to the top of the mountain, apparently without anybody else. At different times he went to the mountain with some of the disciples, and he's spending the night in prayer to God, and God says to him, you need to ordain some apostles. Next slide. This was Jesus' prayer. I desire that those whom you have given me may be with me where I am, to see my glory which you have given me, because you loved me before the foundation of the world. So he was very much person-oriented. He wanted relation. He didn't want to just send the people out to do stuff for him. He wanted relationship with them. And I think that can be said for us as well. Now let's look where this happened. There's a map here. We talked about Capernaum, where the ministry started, and a little bit to the north of there is what's called the Mount of the Beatitudes. We're getting right to the point where Jesus taught the Beatitudes. Immediately after he ordained the apostles, he taught the Beatitudes. And we see that it's really not too far away. You can't tell on the map, but I'm going to show you a picture of where this is. And you can see the Sea of Galilee from there. It'd be like going down on, what's that county road that goes from Bristol Springs to the high road to Naples and overlooking the lake there. What is it? 12. It'd be like that. It's a place where you could really see the beauty of the hills and so forth, and that's on the next slide. Let's see if we can see it. Oh yeah, you can see it there. That's where I got it from. That blue, that darker blue, that's the sea. Next slide. And when day came, he called his disciples and chose 12 of them, whom he also named apostles. Now, there's been an argument in the church, I mean, up until recent times. I think there's more understanding of what an apostle is today, but there was a long time where the organized church said there were only 12 apostles. There are no more apostles than the 12. Well, the problem with that kind of thinking is that there are other apostles mentioned in the New Testament. In fact, one of them is a female. I don't know what you do with that, but the church started out egalitarian, where females and males were equal, and then the Greek culture crept into it, and the Roman culture crept into it, and that's when the women started to be excluded. What's the difference between an apostle and a disciple? A disciple is a learner. Jesus had 70 disciples. They were people who followed him from place to place. They listened to what he had to say. They attempted to pattern their own individual lives after the teachings of Jesus. They were people that understood who Jesus was. Eventually, they understood who he was, and they recognized that he had a good lesson for them, so they were students. Jesus said, "It's enough for the disciple to be as the teacher." Now, an apostle is something completely different. An apostle is someone who is sent forth. It's like when the president sends somebody to another country to talk with their representative. It means to be sent. Now, it's interesting because the passage here says, I think in Mark, Rick was telling me the other day, that the passage is he wanted to draw them together and be with him, but the word apostle actually means to go away from him to a different place. It means to send forth with orders. Now, that word order means ordination. When I was younger, I thought maybe there wasn't anything in the Bible about ordination, because I was going to Bible school and stuff, and I said, where is that in the Bible? And then as I studied, I realized that Jesus sent them with orders. The apostles ordained people to go here and go there and be represented. It's really a very well-documented doctrine in the New Testament of ordination. The problem with a lot of ordination in the world today is, as Spurgeon would say, if God doesn't call them, it's simply empty hands on empty heads. If God isn't the ordainer, then it isn't really an ordination, even though a seminary might lay hands on somebody. And that's why we have all the trouble in some of these mainline denominational churches. I almost went off. Never mind. Ordination to a place appointed. How many of you know about Myers-Briggs personality theory? Okay, Neil, you raised your hand. So, can you give Neil a mic there, and tell us what your Myers-Briggs test shows? Can you remember?
Got a little flavor. They actually said I should be like a social worker, a nurse, and work in more of a Commonwealth type fields where I would work with helping people out. I'm like, yeah, but I don't think I can handle it. That was, I think, the very first test
To become,
matriculated.
oh, into college.
I forgot it was an EJGT or something like that. I just know everything had to do with being a social worker, being a nurse, being something along the line of helping out many others.
Yeah, this is a common thing. I had to do this when I was in seminary, where you take the test and it asks you a number of different questions, and it tries to pinpoint between these different things: extroversion or introversion, sensing or intuition, thinking or feeling, judgment or perception. Did you have to do anything like this? You didn't raise your hand, did you? Okay, you didn't raise your hand, so I won't ask you. When I took the test, I turned out to be an ISTJ, which is introverted, sensing, thinking, and judgmental. And it's kind of a rare mixture for pastors, to say the least. People say, well, you're not introverted. Oh, you don't know me that well. It is a struggle for me to get up and be around with people. If I can find somebody I know at the table, I mean, that's where I go. Thinking, people have said to me, you don't care how I feel. And I say, you don't care what I think. To me, thinking trumps feeling. If it's a fact, I don't care how you feel about it. And so that can be a problem between you and me because we're different. And I might think you're wishy-washy. But all of these things are part of humanity in general. And if we don't understand that we're different and we think differently, even though we're raised in the same culture, like the disciples were raised in the same culture, they were completely different in many ways. And I want to show you what some of those ways are. Now, they didn't have Myers-Briggs theory in those days, but it really is. Once I took the test and I looked at the result, I said, yeah, that's me. So I have a problem if somebody's all, feely. Just because you feel something doesn't mean that it's right. Okay. Simon, who he called Peter, and his brother Andrew and James and John and Philip and Bartholomew. Now, I want you to understand first off that all of these guys have two names. They have a given name. Now, in this case, his name is actually Cephas because he is an Aramaic Jew. The Aramaic language is, if you look in the New American Standard Bible, the nation of Syria is called Aram. Jesus spoke Aramaic. Yes, he spoke Greek. Yes, he read Hebrew, but his main language with which he grew up was Aramaic. And the same is also true of Peter, and his name was Cephas, which in that language means stone. But in Greek, Peter means rock or stone. So a Greek-speaking person would call him Peter. Aramaic person would call him Cephas. And if you look at the references to Cephas all through Paul, all through the writings of Paul, he's called Cephas, not Peter, because Paul was very well acquainted with the Aramaic language. Peter is the root word for petrify. Not petrify in the sense, I'm petrified of him. Petrify is in the sense of there used to be a tree here and it rotted away and other stone came in and replaced it and it's immovable and heavy. And the word impetuous comes from the word Peter. Acting or done quickly without thought or care. See, Greek is a basis for a lot of our language. And Peter was a hardhead who followed Jesus, he was an extrovert. He gets all of the glory and uh, all of the problems where Jesus calls him the devil, and he's butting heads with Jesus all the time. He's the kind of guy that say, even if I have to die with you, I will not deny you. Oh yeah, Peter, wait until 3 in the morning when the bell or when the cock crows. Which cock crowing. If you look in the New Testament, cock crowing is when they blasted the trumpet at 3 a.m. You don't know if your Lord comes in evening, midnight, cock crowing, or in the morning. Jesus said. So it's talking about every 3 hours in their understanding of their Timex. Before 3 a.m. And Peter's denying there that he knows him, and the cock crows, and Jesus looks over at Peter, and Peter looks at Jesus and remembers where just that day he said he'd go with him to the death. And so he's kind of a knucklehead, to say the very least. And yet, he kind of did more than any of the other 12. And he's mentioned more than any of the others. Any comments on Peter? Next slide. Andrew. Andrew is Peter's brother. It's kind of hard for a younger brother if the older brother is more famous or more accomplished. He's family, though. We see in John that Andrew, in fact, was a disciple of John the Baptist. And Jesus came along. I mean, we know the story of the baptism of Jesus. Jesus comes along. John says, this is the guy. He baptizes Jesus. And then all of a sudden, Andrew leaves John the Baptist and follows Jesus. And some of John's other disciples say, people are leaving you and they're following Jesus. And John says, I must decrease, he must increase. But Andrew was one of those people, and he went and found his brother Peter and led him to the Lord. Now, in one of the Gospels, it gives a story of that they're fishing and Jesus calls them, but obviously he had already heard who Jesus was from his brother when Jesus came and called them. He first found his own brother, Simon. We found the Messiah, which is translated the Christ. And he brought him to Jesus, and Jesus looked at him and said, you are Simon the son of John, and shall be called Cephas, which translated is Peter. So he has 3 names. And we'll see that all of these guys have at least 2 names. What was his real name? His real name was Cephas. That's the one his parents gave him. When he was spoken of in Greek, they called him Peter. Simon is Simeon of the Old Testament, one of the sons of Israel. James, next slide. James, it doesn't tell us who the father of James is in Luke, but it tells us in Matthew that he is the son of Zebedee, and his brother is John. Mark tells us James the son of Zebedee and John the brother of James, to them he gave the name Boanerges, which means sons of thunder. Jesus referred to these 2 brothers together as loud and scary. Look at the last verse there. These people didn't listen to Jesus, and James and John said, God, you want us to call down fire from heaven? Well, it means, would you like us to tell God to strike them with lightning? Because that's how fire came to the earth in their understanding. They didn't know a scientific, these things happen between the clouds, and they didn't know all that stuff. All they knew is that when it rained hard, there was sometimes a rainbow, and fire would sometimes come down and set the forest on fire. And so these guys are saying, if anybody doesn't follow us or follow Jesus, we might as well strike them dead. Does this sound like a Christian way to look at things? And Jesus said to them, you don't know what kind of spirit you are of. Now look at the third group there. It tells us something here that's not found elsewhere in the New Testament. We see that James and John, the sons of Zebedee, were partners with Peter and Andrew in business. They're business partners. I don't know if they were family business partners, or I don't know if they weren't family business partners, but when you're in a partnership with somebody, then you have kind of a really close relationship. You have to. You have to understand who you're working with, and you have, before you enter into any kind of relationship like that, you better know who you're dealing with, because partnerships are kind of a dangerous thing. Sometimes one partner will take advantage over another partner. So we see that there's a familial relationship between Peter and Andrew and James and John. Next slide. John. Teacher, we saw someone casting out demons in your name, and we tried to prevent him because he was not following us. That church over there, they're holy rollers and they're casting demons. We told them to stop because everybody knows there's no demons anymore, and everybody knows the church doesn't have the authority to cast out demons anymore, and we alone are right. So I told that church over there to stop. This spirit is still with us. John portrays himself in the Gospel of John as being the disciple that Jesus loved. And at the Last Supper, he lays his head on the shoulder of Jesus, and they have this really close relationship. But if you don't agree with him, I'm not going to call down lightning on anybody, but they have to stop because they're not right. We alone are right. Does this sound familiar to anybody? Philip, next slide. The next day he purposed to go into Galilee. He found Philip. By the way, if your Bible has those asterisks, found, said, it literally should be translated. It doesn't work well in English, but how they do it is they take the translation which says, and he finds Philip and he says to him. That's how the words really are. It's in the present tense. This puts it in the past tense because it works better in English. He finds Philip and he says to him, follow me. And we see in the next one that Philip is also from Bethsaida, the city of Andrew and Peter. They're all from the same village. They're all from the same local church. They're all related to each other either by family or by business arrangements. They all find Jesus at basically the same time. And Philip found Nathanael and said, we found him whom Moses in the law and the prophets wrote, Jesus of Nazareth, the son of Joseph. They knew the family, they knew the father, they knew Mary, they knew the brothers that are mentioned in the book of Matthew, all of the relatives of Jesus. Next slide. Simon, who he named Peter, and his brother Andrew, Bartholomew. Now, Bartholomew is also called Nathanael. Bartholomew means the son of Ptolemy. Ptolemy, I guess, something like that. Nathanael means the gift of God. So Philip, he's an evangelist. He goes out and he finds Nathanael and he witnesses about Jesus. Nathanael says, any good thing come out of Nazareth? When we were kids in Bloomfield, we always looked down on the kids from Honeoye. And we'd say, he should be living in Honeoye. And I think the Honeoye people said, I think they're from Cohocton. You know, it's everybody looks down on the next town that's not as enlightened as they are. And so Nathanael says, nothing good can come from Nazareth. And you know the story. Jesus has a word of knowledge and says, behold an Israelite in whom there's no deceit. Now I do not know how to interpret this. And what you could take it at face value and say, oh, this guy was like a really good person. And Jesus recognized that right away. Or it could be sarcasm. Oh, look at this guy who thinks he's better than others. I don't know. Take your choice. I mean, the words can be read either way. And Jesus said, I saw you before Nathanael called you. Next slide. And Matthew. Jesus went on from there. He saw Matthew sitting at the tax collector. He's called Levi in the book of Luke, but Matthew in his own book. And Matthew follows Jesus. We talked about him extensively already. Next slide. And Thomas, called Didymus. Thomas, you know, we name our kids Tom. We didn't name our kids Tom because Sean's father was named Tom. No, that's not why we didn't. We just didn't think of it. And it means a twin. And Didymus is the Greek word that we get, the English word ditto. Identical twins. But only one of the two is called to be an apostle. You know, it's like Jacob and his brother. Only Jacob is called. We found the Lord. Thomas gets the doubting Thomas thing. Unless I see the holes in his hands and feet, and unless I put my hand into his side where they stabbed him, I won't believe it. And now Jesus shows up. Okay, go for it. Doubting Thomas. These guys all have their shortfalls, don't they? James, the son of Alphaeus. Next slide. He passed by and he saw Levi, the son of Alphaeus, sitting in the tax booth. He's the brother of Matthew, who's collecting taxes in Capernaum, where Peter and Andrew and James and John are doing fishing on the lake, and Matthew is taking the taxes from them when they come back with their catch. Ordinarily not going to get along too well. Look at this one, Mark chapter 15, verse 40. This is the women at the cross. There were also some women looking on from the distance who were Mary Magdalene, or Mary of Magdala, and Mary, the mother of James the Less. So Alphaeus is also a disciple, the father of Matthew and the father of James the Less, and his mother is Mary, the friend of Mary, the mother of Jesus, and is at the cross together with her when Jesus is crucified. Again, family relationship. Next slide. And Simon, who was called the Zealot. Now this is from Josephus. I don't know if you're familiar with Josephus. He wrote a history of the Jews after the destruction of Jerusalem by the Romans. And he gave a history of, Old Testament history and up through the time of the Maccabees, the intertestamental period between the end of the Old Testament and the beginning of the New Testament, where the Maccabees lived, time frame of the Maccabees. And they were called zealots who vigorously adhered to the Mosaic law. Is it lawful to pay taxes to Caesar? No. Is it lawful to carry the soldiers baggage for a mile like the law says. No. Don't do anything for them. They are oppressors. We are free people. In fact, if we can overthrow it, who was that guy that was crucified next to Jesus? Who was the guy that was released when Jesus was crucified? We want Barabbas. The oldest versions of the New Testament, or some of the oldish versions say, his name was Jesus Barabbas. Jesus is a common name. It's the same name as Joshua, and in Greek it would be Jesus. Bar is son, Abbas is father. Jesus, the son of the Father, is released, who is a criminal, who is a revolutionary, a robber. They wanted him released instead of Jesus. He was probably in this group called Zealots. They were very revolutionary, and they would kill somebody if they thought that it would help them with what they were trying to do, to throw off the Roman rule. To even call this guy was very dangerous for Jesus. You know, sometimes people that Jesus calls are dangerous people. Sometimes they've done horrific things. And so we have the tax collector that's collecting for the government, and they have in the same group of 12, somebody that's politically diametrically opposed to Matthew. And yet they're called at the same time. They follow Jesus at the same time. They hear the same teaching. And so he's called people with completely different worldview to be in the church sometime. Now, they come from the same society and they come from the same culture, but they have a different view on what the culture is. You know, some of these liberal Christians, these bleeding heart, those on the Myers-Briggs scale for feeling, are really and truly Christians. They tend to stay in their own church. But, you know, some of them, they really love people, and so therefore, but not Simon the Zealot. He's a judgmental SOB. Excuse me. Sorry. That's how I really talk, so. Judas, the son of James, next slide, and Judas Iscariot. We see in Mark chapter 3, verse 18, that James, the son of Alphaeus, who is related to Matthew, his father is Alphaeus as well. On the day you will know that I am in my Father, you are in me. They who have my commandments, they keep them. Judas, not Iscariot. It's really bad when you have to have. Don't let the reader mistake this Judas with the other Judas. You know, Judah is Abraham, Isaac, Judah, David, Jesus. He's the progenitor of the Jews. In Hebrew, his name is Judah. In Greek, his name is Judas. And so it's kind of ironic that, his name means praise. When the original Judah was born, his mother said, "Praise the Lord," and so they named him Praise. This guy says, "How will we know that you will reveal yourself to us and not the world?" And he said, "Those who love me will keep my word. My Father will love them." So the only thing that we know about this guy, Judas, not Iscariot, is that he was not afraid to ask a question when he didn't understand. We don't know anything else about him other than his name. Oops. Next slide. And Judas Iscariot, who became a traitor. I've heard this argument. Being around Pentecostal people, there was, some of them that were exorcists. And among the so-called charismatic exorcists who I knew in those days, there were some that said Christian couldn't have a demon. And so some would say, well, Judas was never really a believer. And so that's why he could have a devil. That's why he did what he did. If he was really a believer, he wouldn't have done that. And in two places, Luke and John both, in Luke it says Satan, which means the adversary of Jesus, entered into Judas. And in John it says the devil entered into the heart of Judas, the son of Simon Iscariot, to betray him. This shows us that there is actually a personification of evil. There is actually a being according to the New Testament. Some people want to say, well, the devil is just, the devil doesn't really exist. It's just that he gets blamed for all the bad things that happen. But the devil, according to this, does exist. And according to this, the devil did enter into Judas. And if you want to argue with whether he was a Christian or not, that you can argue about. They said, some people said, well, Judas took communion at the Last Supper. Well, if you know anything about the Passover, you will see that Judas did not take communion at the Last Supper. Truly, truly, I say to you, one of you will betray me. And John leans over on Jesus and says, who is it? And Jesus takes, it says in the King James Version, the sop, and he dipped it. Well, in the Passover, there's a green herb called the carpus, and it's in the beginning of the meal, and it's a vegetable that they take and they dip into the salt water, which represents the tears of the slavery that the Jews were subjected to before they were redeemed and released, and the Passover lamb was slain and so forth. And so in the part of the meeting where the tears of slavery are remembered, Jesus, unbeknownst to everybody except for John, who said, which one is it? Jesus reaches over, he takes the carpus, and I think it was broccoli, yuck, and he dips it in the salt water and hands it to Judas. And Judas immediately gets up and runs out. So he did not take communion. And he went on and betrayed the Lord. Now the name means praise. The son of Simon Iscariot, which means men of Kerioth, which means the city. So his name means praise for the city life. Praise for the good life. Next slide. But when the disciples saw it, they were angry, and they said, why this waste? This anointment could have been sold for a large sum and the money given to the poor. Sounds right, doesn't it? Jesus said, let her alone. You have the poor always, you don't always have me. But what I want you to notice about this is on the next slide. Judas, one of the disciples, the one who was about to betray him, said, why was this perfume not sold? And I want you to understand something. You don't get this unless you know the whole story. Judas was in fact the most respected of the apostles because he had the money. And he used to, it says in one version, pilfer. This version, I think, says steal. He used to take some of it out for himself. He's dishonest apostle. And he says, why was this not sold? And everybody said, yeah, that's right. We should have used this for something else. We should have given this money to the poor, but there's what you say and what's really in your heart. You know, for a bad person, what's really in their heart is not the same as what they say. Because we're smart enough to figure out what to say. But when we have an ulterior motive, he just wanted some money. How much did he want? I suspect he needed 30 pieces of silver. Had to buy a new mule. You know, 30 pieces of silver is a month's wages, 30 days' wages. So he runs out and, how much do you want? I need 30. They weighed it out. You know, went by weight in those days. They weighed it out. Here you go. How will you let us know which guy he is? You know, he's from Galilee, and this is Jerusalem. We don't know what he looks like. Oh, don't worry. I'll just give him a kiss. I'll pretend I love him. So those are our apostles. Did Jesus call him to be an apostle? It says very clearly in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, he did. He did call him. Did Jesus know what he would do? I think he must have. I mean, it's speculation, but I think he must have known. So, a bunch of knuckleheads, just like us, but they changed the world. Any comments? I know we're out of time. Back here, Jim.
The scripture says Jesus knew what it was in a man's heart, so I believe he knew what was in Judas Iscariot's heart. So,
Was that? I'm trying to remember where that passage is. Is that?
I think it might be John.
Oh yeah, he didn't entrust himself to any man because he knew what was in man's heart. Yeah, I'm familiar with that scripture. Good point. Priscilla?
I have a question for you. So the Grange was the Knights of the Maccabees Hall before it became the Grange. So did they have any relationship with the Maccabees?
The Maccabees were, the main Maccabee was Judas Maccabeus. And the story of the Maccabees is the story of Hanukkah. And the people came and took over. This was like 186 BC or something like that. And they came and they said that the Jews could not continue their religion, and they brought an idol and they set it up in the temple. And that was called the abomination that makes desolate. And that's what Jesus referred to in Matthew chapter 24. It was a historical fact. And Jesus said, when you see the abomination of desolation in the holy place, then let those who are in Judea flee to the hills. And so when the Romans came in and sacrificed the pig in AD 70, he was referring to, you know, when you see this happen again, then you've got to get out of Jerusalem. And so the Maccabees, there's two books of Maccabees. First Maccabees is a historical book. Second Maccabees is a bunch of baloney. But it tells the story of Hanukkah, how the candles burn for 8 days and they only should have burned for 1 day and stuff like that. So it's probably named after that, but that's who the Maccabees were. Anyone else? Okay, look at that. We're going to be really, really late. I'm going to wash my hands. We're going to take communion. If you plan on betraying Jesus, you can get out now. If you plan on, even with all of your shortcomings, want to come and receive forgiveness and go